Good morning, Ohio State fans. Welcome back to the 11 Dubcast for Tuesday, September 16th. I am joined by the one, the only, the film study guru himself, Kyle Jones. Kyle, how are you this splendid Tuesday as we prepare for Ohio State's bye week?
Just in enjoying this nice fall weather. It's like the perfect time of year. It's warm. This is the best time of year, man. Football's on. We got stuff to talk about all the time, but the weather's great. So yeah, living my best life right now.
Yeah, especially in a southern climate, it's nice to be able to wear stuff with sleeves again. I have to say, it diversifies my wardrobe a little bit as opposed to, wearing t-shirts on the Dubcast every day, which I'm very thankful for now. We are going to get into the highly anticipated film study preview, as they always are with Mr. Jones. But before we do that, we want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor, First Bank of Central Ohio. They are the official bank of 11 Warriors and the sponsor of this program, the 11 Dubcast. From game day to workday, First Bank of Central Ohio is proud to support the business owners that keep Central Ohio thriving. They are locally owned, business focused, and always in your corner. Give them a visit at fbcentralohio.com. Mr. Jones, it was a bit more of a contentious Ohio State football game than some of us were expecting, given the prominence Ohio State has had over its in-state competition for the last century plus at this point. Also, the fact that it was a MAC team. Nevertheless, Ohio, we knew they were going to be pretty decently positioned, I think, given the upset over West Virginia, the fact that they made it a close game with Rutgers. That being said, it was a little too close for comfort. And of course, as classical Ohio State fans, we are never satisfied unless this team covers the spread and then some. It is, as our favorite Amazon shopping cart detective, Brett McMurphy, likes to say, good teams win, great teams cover. And Ohio State missed covering the spread by half a point. So we're obviously very upset about it. But out of that discontent breeds the ability to improve and reflect on mistakes. So I'm curious, given the fact that it seems like that there's a lot Ohio State has to work on during the bye week, preparing for the first road test of the season against Washington, what most stands out to you in terms of what you're going to focus on for film study this week relative to what we saw against Ohio?
Yeah, I think the rewatch felt so much different than it did in real time, candidly. When you don't have the announcers, you don't necessarily feel the same, down to down flow. If on the rewatch, Ohio State dominated this game, and it showed on tape, right? You look in the stats, and it's outgaining them 3-1. Look, we're complaining about a game where they scored 37 points and they had 572 yards of offense, and we're still looking. So this is not to say like, oh, hey, what are you guys doing? What are you nitpicking? Like, there were things to learn from, no question. And there were a lot of executional errors, and I actually think it was a great test at the right time, because this is a well-coached team. I don't think there's any question about it. The Ohio Bobcats I'm talking about. They are a well-coached team. There's a reason that they were in it, against Rutgers. There's a reason that they beat West Virginia, who just beat Pitt. This is a solid team, and they don't beat themselves. And I think that's a great test for a team like Ohio State. They presented a few new issues that we'll see on the film. They were doing some interesting things, rotating their safeties late. They were stunting a lot along the D-line, and I actually think that led to a lot of the issues that we saw. Some of the run game issues down in the red zone too. It was just missed assignments, and it's communication. So I think as we think about where this offense, specifically on the offense I'm talking about right now, goes moving forward, they're correctable errors. And I think that's the thing to take away. And we'll talk about this week in film study. They're the type of thing where there's one of the red zone trips where Ohio State doesn't score. I talk about all three plays, first, second, third down. First down, they've got an open pass to Jeremiah in the back corner, but Sayan's forced to scramble because Sareveld and Luke Montgomery start double teaming one guy, a nose tackle, and then both inexplicably leave this guy. They both leave to go help someone else. It's just a pure communication error.
Yeah.
This guy's free to run straight up the middle, forces Sayan out of the pocket. Now, the window he had to throw has gone, and there's nowhere to go with the football. They're little things like that. It's not the type of issues, watching the game in real time. I was with a bunch of friends, and both of them were going Some were going, this feels like the McCord years. This feels like when Ohio State couldn't run
I
the
don't know if it's that
ball.
serious.
Yeah, and I was like, okay, it's a Saturday night, watching, having a good time. So, I wasn't ready to totally put on that, but I can understand why that was the takeaway, right? Lou Holtz is somewhere loving life, watching that, but this was not Ohio State not being able to get movement off the ball. This was two guys blocking one guy while the guy that makes the tackle goes unblocked. It's things like that that are executional. They're small errors, they're correctable, and it comes at a great time ahead of a bye week, right? There's a lot of time to fix those type of errors. And you know that as Ohio State, you've got to be prepared to face teams' best shot, right? Ohio came in with a game plan. It's not like they went into this game and said, well, we're just going to run our base stuff and hope it works out. No, they're going to bring their A game. They're going to bring wrinkles. They're going to do things to try to surprise Ohio State. And there's a lot of new starters on this team. They did a great job with Texas. They had a great game plan. They had all year to prepare for it. Now you've got to change your mindset into that. We've got really 3 days of practice to install a game plan and prepare for whoever the next opponent is. So I think this was a really good test, especially for that offense, to have to gel, to have to learn from those mistakes, because I think they were executional mistakes. They're not the kind of thing that makes you go, ooh, I don't know if Ohio State, this could be a problem all year long. Well, no, man, just pick up the double team properly. Just execute it. It's there. Just finish the job.
Yeah, and for anybody else that may be worried that the majority of this game was a throwback to the McCord years, I think it is worth pointing out that I believe, 347 passing yards Julian Sayin had in this game were the most for an Ohio State quarterback since CJ Stroud against Georgia in the Peach Bowl back in the college football playoff. So that includes both the McCord era and the Will Howard era that Sayin put up better numbers than. So I don't think it's that serious. I'm glad that you framed it around, regardless of what you may think about this game, when you go back and look at it, Ohio State still dominated, because I think that speaks to a couple different things. Um, I helped cover the game this weekend. I did the post game press conference with the man responsible for the well coached Ohio Bobcats you just mentioned, Brian Smith. He didn't have a lot to say about Ohio State specifically. He mostly kept it on, how proud he was of his guys and everything, which is what a lot of coaches do when they lose by 4 touchdowns against an opponent they're overmatched against. But he was very complimentary to Matt Patricia, and particularly in terms of something that we have talked about in recent weeks, which is his ability to implement NFL caliber concepts and have college talents that may not necessarily be familiar with executing those high level concepts, deploy them in the game, and to do that at this early stage of the season in his first year in the role is something that is very impressive, and something that you've obviously made a heavy subject of film study in the first couple weeks of this season. So on top of that, the way that Ohio State dominated this game, I think that part of the reason why it was too close for comfort, but at the same time, it never got to the point where it was like, oh my God, is this going to be the first team from Ohio in over 100 years to beat the Buckeyes? It never got to that point because you felt so confident in the defense. And I think that was reflected in how atypically conservative Ryan Day was in terms of when they turn the ball over on downs on that first drive that you said you're going to highlight and talk about. And then after that, I mentioned this with Chase yesterday. One of the secret sauces I have in terms of making my score predictions is that I only pick Ohio State to score touchdowns, because I never think that Ryan Day is going to go out of his way to kick a field goal. It hardly ever happens, and it happened multiple times in this game. But I think part of that was kind of being a little bit shell shocked with getting stopped, turned over on downs, just wanting to take the points when they did get into the red zone or close to scoring range early in the game. And I think you only feel confident in doing that you don't have to go guns blazing to get as many points as possible if you're confident your defense is going to be able to get stops. And that's exactly what they did in this game. So, yeah, I think a rewatch would probably be good for everybody in terms of if you're worried the world is on fire after this game, where Ohio State still ended up winning by 28 points and still holding their opponent to under double digits in terms of scoring, which I don't expect to actually be breached until the team plays Illinois in mid-October. So, but time will tell on that one. At the risk of content fatigue for the audience, I feel it is important to bring up the development that we've spoken about on this YouTube channel at 11 Warriors coming out of the Ohio game. The big talking line is obviously the breakout performance of one Bo Jackson. Everybody knows Bo now. If they didn't know them before, now they know Bo. And it's interesting because I actually didn't even think that CJ Donaldson was unimpressive. And I thought he was clearly the better back. As you predicted, he would emerge ahead of James Peoples as the season wore on, in when we did our first show before the season started. And it was a very apt call by you, but it's an interesting development now where you go back and you look at the stats. James Peoples actually outgained Donaldson in this game and was actually more efficient with his carries, which it didn't really feel like, and was a little bit of a surprise to me upon reflecting on the stat sheet. But clearly, Bo Jackson not only outperformed both of them, but had the best performance any Ohio State running back has had within these first 3 games of the season, to the point where now people are calling for him to be the starting guy. I'm just curious what your thoughts are about if this one performance against an opponent that was not as overmatched as Grambling State was, where he had his first good game that was largely in, a second half that could be effectively called garbage time, but still against an opponent that most people recognize was overmatched, even though they were having good success early in the game in terms of their own defense. How do you, given your own fondness for CJ Donaldson, how do you feel about where Bo Jackson factors into this backfield equation going forward? And would you feel comfortable promoting him to that lead role, or maybe making this look more like a 2 or 3 back committee going forward?
Well, I think it's definitely a two-back committee. I think that's been the case with the starting offense for the first couple of games. And I believe it'll become more of a three-man show as we move forward. And that's not a bad thing for anyone, keeping them fresh. I absolutely see the burst that I think a lot of people saw, right? He just has another gear that the other two probably don't have to run away. Um, and that's great. Ohio State's needed that. They need, you saw what a difference it made to have Travion Henderson as the changeup. You need that guy sometimes. But as we also saw for the first couple of years of Trey's career here, you need something else too. That's not the only piece of being a good running back. And Bo's also not huge, right? So you need to have, I think, it helps to have a guy who's 6'3", 240. Now, that said, CJ showed he can run a little high. One of the goal line plays, he was, he got stoned by, it was a great tackle by Ohio's safety. But, you expect a 240-pound guy to run over a defensive back like that. But I'm going to caveat all of that by saying I think Bo Jackson got the carries once the offensive line figured out a lot of their issues that I mentioned earlier, and I think he was not. It wasn't the only reason. Certainly, I mean, he ran really well. He saw the holes, exploded through them, but he also benefited from the offensive line having having a few trips out on the field, seeing some of those stunts. The defensive line moving around late. Safeties coming down into the box late that weren't picked up in the blocking schemes. You saw him, you saw the offensive line figure that out as the game went on. And that's really when Bo started to play more. So I think Donaldson and Peoples kind of had to be the guinea pigs early on as the offensive line figured those things out. And as a result, some of their lines probably didn't look as strong. Although, you can find clips throughout the entire second half. Ohio State changed things up. They used a lot more shifts and motions, which really held Ohio to kind of have to be the last one to move, right? And that always, that it's a little bit of the cat and mouse game you see with all the shifts and motions. You want to be the one that moves last and then snap it right away. And in the first half, Ohio was the one moving last, and you see that a lot with Matt Patricia's defense. They're often the ones moving last, and so they've got the advantage. The Buckeyes started moving a lot more shifts and motions, and so that left the Bobcats forced to kind of figure it out on the fly. That allowed Ohio State to have more advantageous numbers in the run game. And again, Bo had a couple of his big runs in that moment, but you also saw Donaldson and people. So I think the takeaway is not, well, those two are bad and Bo is good. I think it's more so Ohio State's got a third guy that you can expect to get carries. And as the season progresses, we know guys are going to get dinged up. So the more bodies you have that you can rely on to carry the football, the better.
Yeah, and I do believe that in terms of the splits of carries by the end of this one, I think that Donaldson and Jackson each had 9 carries, and then Peoples only he had 7, so he only had 2 less than the others. So they did it's a pretty fairly even three-way split between those 3 guys. So it wouldn't necessarily shock me to see a distribution of touches like that moving forward as opposed to the more two-man committees that we've seen in previous games, as you alluded to. I do think it's interesting that you invoke Travion because that was something that I mentioned in talking about this with Chase yesterday. Is that there were a lot of moments where there were holes there that I was seeing James Peoples get into, but then get tackled at like 4 or 6 yards downfield, and just thinking, if that's Travion last year, that's a house call. Like the burst just isn't quite there, which is why I think so many people were advocating for Jackson to become the starter coming out of this one. But the other side of what you brought up in terms of invoking Henderson, one of my favorite Charles Barkleyisms is the best ability is availability. And that, for as great of a career as Travion had as a Buckeye, a lot of the middle of it was plagued by injuries. That's the main reason I think why Judkins was such a blessing for this team last season, is that his ability to offload some of that work so that Henderson could do the most with about 10 touches for the ball per game and still be very efficient with those touches. And it worked out very well for both guys. I think that you probably see something similar here in terms of, even though we don't necessarily have injury concerns for any of the 3 guys that are still on the team at this point, having all of them available there and getting all those guys reps and experience can only serve well in terms of not only keeping them all healthy, but in the event one of them were to become unavailable, you have the other 2 that are fresh enough where they're able to take on the work that would be left in wake of one not being available. So I think it's definitely a positive development for the team overall, and it'll be interesting to see how the distribution works out, if it does, in terms of what we're anticipating coming out of the bye week. But we do have plenty of time until that point. It won't be until September 27th, unfortunately. Thankfully, there's plenty of good college football games to look forward to this weekend. But before that, we have Jones's film study to look forward to first and foremost on Thursday afternoon. So we'll be looking forward to that. Make sure that you're subscribed to 11 Warriors YouTube channel in order to be ready when that drops. Jones, thank you very much for joining us today. Look forward to having you again next week to preview whatever you're going to come up with coming out of the bye week. I'm sure we'll look forward to you perhaps having to draw a bit of water out of a stone in that sense. But, there's still plenty to talk about in terms of what's happened over the first 3 games and where Ohio State can improve. Until then, thank you very much for tuning in. We will be back with the 11 Dubcast again with Dan Hope tomorrow morning. Thank you and take care, folks.